December 1944. Cold rain hammered the Belgian forest as American artillery crews watched another V-1 rocket tear across the sky. They fired. The shell exploded seconds too late. The rocket continued. 3 miles away, civilians died. Captain James Harrigan crushed his coffee cup against the muddy earth, feeling the weight of every miss, every life lost to timing errors no gunner could overcome. Then a sealed crate arrived from Washington with a single word stenciled in red: classified. Inside were shells that looked ordinary, but contained something the Germans would never anticipate. A technology so revolutionary that when it finally revealed itself over the Ardennes, enemy commanders would question the very laws of physics themselves. January 1942, roll 340 hours, Naval Research Laboratory, Washington, D.C. The fluorescent lights hummed as Dr. Merle Tuve pressed his palm against the cold window, watching snow accumulate on Constitution Avenue. Behind him, oscilloscope screens traced the signature of failure, another artillery shell detonating 300 feet from its target. 300 feet meant survival for enemy aircraft. 300 feet meant dead American pilots who never made it home. The numbers carved themselves into every conversation at NRL. Of every 100 anti-aircraft shells fired at enemy bombers, 97 exploded uselessly. Timed fuses required gunners to calculate target altitude, speed, trajectory, and set a mechanical timer, all while aircraft maneuvered unpredictably at 300 miles per hour. The mathematics were impossible. Human reaction time guaranteed failure. Since Pearl Harbor, 14 months of combat data confirmed what everyone knew, but nobody wanted to say. America was losing the air war not because of courage or firepower, but because shells couldn't explode at the right moment. Dr. Tuve was 41, raised on a Minnesota farm where his father repaired threshing machines by intuition and stubbornness. That practical Midwestern engineering philosophy now confronted the most complex challenge of the war. He needed a shell that could think, a projectile that could sense its target and detonate automatically at the perfect distance. The concept violated every assumption of artillery doctrine. Shells were supposed to be simple, rugged, mass-produced. What Tuve proposed required miniaturized electronics surviving 15,000 times the force of gravity during firing, functioning flawlessly while spinning at 500 rotations per second, operating reliably in temperatures from Arctic cold to tropical heat, and costing little enough to manufacture by the millions. His team consisted of 23 physicists and engineers recruited from universities across America: MIT, Caltech, Stanford, Carnegie Tech. Most had never seen combat. Several had been teaching freshman physics 6 months earlier. Now they worked 18-hour shifts in a secured basement laboratory, surrounded by classified blueprints and prototype circuits that represented the largest concentrated investment in applied physics outside the Manhattan Project. The pressure was institutional and immediate. Naval commanders wanted results yesterday. Budget overseers questioned every dollar. Skeptical artillery officers insisted the whole concept was theoretical fantasy that would fail in field conditions. The core challenge was miniaturization beyond anything previously attempted. They needed to fit a complete radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonation circuit into a space smaller than a coffee thermos, using vacuum tubes and components designed for stationary laboratory equipment. When fired, the shell would experience acceleration forces that would crush a human body instantly. The electronics had to survive that violence, then function perfectly while spinning at rates that would disorient any mechanical system. Early prototypes failed spectacularly. Vacuum tubes shattered, circuits short-circuited, batteries exploded. Dr. Tuve stood before a blackboard covered in equations describing electromagnetic wave propagation. The principle was elegant in theory. The shell would emit a continuous radio signal forward. When reflected waves from a nearby aircraft returned, the interference pattern would trigger detonation automatically. No human calculation required. No timing error possible. The shell would sense its own proximity to the target and detonate at the mathematically optimal distance, close enough for lethal fragmentation, far enough to avoid premature explosion. The concept originated from British research on radar proximity, but American industrial capacity would transform theory into mass-produced reality. December 1941 had forced urgency that peacetime would never provide. After Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt personally approved unlimited funding. Secretary of War Stimson designated the proximity fuse as priority equal to atomic weapons research. Production facilities were constructed simultaneously with prototype development, a calculated gamble that the design would work because America couldn't afford the time to perfect it leisurely. Factories in Detroit and Cleveland retooled from consumer manufacturing to precision electronics assembly. Workers who had built radios and telephones now assembled microscopic circuits under magnification, each component hand-soldered by women whose small hands and patience exceeded anything automation could provide. The team worked through Christmas 1941 without pause. Families went without fathers, marriages strained under absence, health deteriorated from exhaustion and stress. Dr. Tuve himself collapsed twice from fatigue, returning to work within hours against medical advice. The emotional burden was tangible. Every day spent in development meant more American aircraft shot down, more ships sunk, more soldiers killed by enemy fighters who operated with impunity because American anti-aircraft fire couldn't touch them effectively. By March 1942, they achieved laboratory success. A prototype shell detonated precisely 20 feet from a simulated target in controlled conditions. The celebration lasted 10 minutes before harsh reality returned. Laboratory success meant nothing without field reliability. The shell had to survive naval storage in saltwater spray, extreme temperature variation, rough handling by exhausted crews under combat stress, and the catastrophic violence of artillery firing. One failure in 100 meant dead Americans. One failure in 1,000 was the minimum acceptable standard. Achieving that reliability would require 18 more months of brutal testing, redesign, failure analysis, and incremental improvement. The decision to proceed came from Admiral Harold Bowen, Chief of Naval Research, who understood both technical complexity and strategic necessity. He approved full-scale production before final testing was complete, a decision that violated every principle of military procurement but reflected desperate urgency. If the proximity fuse failed, America would have wasted millions of dollars and irreplaceable time. If it succeeded, the calculus of air warfare would shift fundamentally. Admiral Bowen signed the authorization knowing his career depended on that gamble. The first production order was for 10,000 shells, with plans to scale to 50,000 per month if field testing proved successful. The machinery of American industrial might begin turning, converting raw theory into explosive reality. August 1942, Pontiac, Michigan, 0600 hours. The morning shift whistle screamed across the converted automobile factory where Oldsmobile had manufactured sedans 18 months earlier. Now the assembly lines produced something radically different. Artillery shells containing electronic circuits more complex than anything previously mass-produced. The factory operated 24 hours daily, 3 shifts of workers who had never built electronics before, now assembling devices that required precision, measured in thousandths of an inch. Margaret Hayes, aged 27, from a farm outside Lansing, stood at Station 12, assembling vacuum tube mounts. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, developed over 8 months, but her mind never stopped calculating the stakes. Her brother flew B-17s over Germany. Every shell she assembled correctly might save a bomber crew. Every mistake might mean friendly fire casualties or wasted ordnance when supply ships braved U-boat-infested Atlantic crossings. The pressure was omnipresent and exhausting. Workers assembled components they didn't fully understand, following instructions that couldn't explain why precision mattered, trusting that someone somewhere knew what these shells would accomplish. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable initially. Vacuum tubes designed for radios failed immediately under artillery acceleration. Standard batteries exploded, solder joints cracked. Early production runs had failure rates exceeding 60%. Shells that wouldn't detonate, wouldn't survive firing, or detonated prematurely. Each failure required analysis, redesign, and retooling. Engineers from Washington arrived weekly, examining failed components under microscopes, testing materials, redesigning circuits iteratively. The breakthrough came from unexpected sources. A machinist from Detroit noticed that annealing copper connections before soldering prevented cracking under stress. A chemist from DuPont developed a potting compound that protected circuits from shock without adding weight. A young engineer from Wisconsin discovered that slightly changing vacuum tube filament geometry increased survival rates dramatically. These incremental improvements, contributed by hundreds of individuals, gradually transformed an experimental concept into manufacturable reality. Raw materials presented constant crises. Copper was rationed strictly. Tungsten for vacuum tube filaments came from limited suppliers. Glass of sufficient purity for tubes required specialized production. Quartz crystals for radio frequency control were scarce. The War Production Board allocated materials by priority, but demand always exceeded supply. Factory managers improvised constantly, substituting materials, redesigning components to use available resources, cannibalizing rejected shells for reusable parts. The workforce evolved uniquely. Before the war, electronics assembly had been specialized work performed by trained technicians in small batches. Mass production required training thousands of workers rapidly: farm wives, high school graduates, men classified 4F for military service, retirees who returned to contribute. Training programs operated continuously, teaching soldering, circuit testing, quality inspection. The learning curve was brutal. Workers assembled components following strict procedures without understanding underlying electronics. A single misplaced wire could render a shell useless or dangerous. Quality control became obsessive. Every shell underwent multiple inspections. X-ray photography revealed internal assembly defects. Electrical testing verified circuit function. Random samples were subjected to firing tests using special proof grounds where shells were fired and examined for survival. Shells that passed all tests received final assembly, explosive filling, fusing, sealing, and painting. The reject rate gradually declined from 60% to 30%, then to 15%, finally stabilizing at 8% by early 1943. 8% waste was acceptable only because the remaining 92% represented revolutionary capability. The human cost of industrial urgency was measured in exhaustion, injuries, and psychological strain. Workers labored 16-hour shifts when production quotas demanded. Industrial accidents maimed operators who worked fatigued. Marriages collapsed under absence and stress. Health declined from sustained overwork in facilities where ventilation was poor and chemical exposure common, yet absenteeism remained remarkably low. Workers understood the connection between their labor and survival of soldiers overseas. Motivation was personal: brothers in combat, husbands at sea, sons in training camps. Security was absolute and stifling. Workers signed secrecy oaths under threat of prosecution. Armed guards patrolled factory perimeters. Mail was censored. Conversations were monitored. Nobody outside the facility knew what was being produced. Workers couldn't tell families what they built. The isolation was psychologically exhausting, yet necessary, because proximity-fused technology represented strategic advantage that had to be protected absolutely. German intelligence sought desperately to understand why American anti-aircraft effectiveness was improving dramatically. Captured shells were examined carefully, but the electronics were deliberately designed to self-destruct on impact, preventing reverse engineering. By December 1942, production reached 5,000 shells weekly. By March 1943, 20,000 weekly. By June 1943, 40,000. American industrial capacity, once mobilized, proved unstoppable. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and California operated continuously, each producing specialized components that converged in final assembly facilities. The logistics were staggering. Millions of individual parts manufactured to exacting tolerances, shipped under guard, assembled carefully, tested rigorously, packed securely, and delivered to naval depots for distribution to combat zones. The shells began arriving in combat theaters during summer 1943, issued to selected ships and units for operational testing under strict orders to recover all shells possible, whether fired or not, to prevent capture. Gunners were told only that these were improved fuses and given strict instructions about handling and storage. The first combat use occurred in August 1943 when the USS Helena engaged Japanese aircraft in the Solomon Islands. Gunners fired proximity-fused shells alongside conventional ammunition. The difference was immediately apparent. Aircraft that would have survived conventional barrages exploded violently when proximity shells detonated precisely. The kill rate increased dramatically, from 3% to 15% per engagement. Reports were transmitted immediately to Washington with highest classification. The proximity fuse was working in combat. The gamble was paying off. Mass production accelerated toward 100,000 shells monthly, transforming American air defense capability fundamentally. January 1945, 02:20 hours, somewhere over the Ardennes forest. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann, veteran Luftwaffe pilot with 43 missions, pushed his Focke-Wulf 190 through heavy clouds, descending toward American artillery positions that intelligence reported were vulnerable. His squadron had executed similar strikes successfully dozens of times. The approach was calculated carefully: low altitude to avoid radar detection, high speed to minimize exposure, precise timing to strike before defenders could respond effectively. German doctrine relied on mathematics that had proven reliable throughout the war. American anti-aircraft fire was predictable, requiring 3 to 5 seconds between visual acquisition and effective fire. That window allowed skilled pilots to deliver ordnance and escape before barrages became dangerous. Tonight would violate those assumptions completely. Hoffmann broke through cloud cover at 800 meters, immediately spotting American positions illuminated by artillery flashes. He armed weapons and began his attack approach. Then the sky around him exploded in patterns that made no physical sense. Conventional anti-aircraft fire created predictable zones where shells detonated at preset altitudes, leaving gaps that skillful pilots exploited instinctively. But these explosions followed his aircraft, detonating precisely at his altitude, regardless of evasive maneuvers. When he dove, explosions followed downward. When he climbed desperately, detonations tracked upward. The barrage anticipated his movements as if the shells themselves were alive, hunting him personally. Shrapnel punctured his left wing. Hoffmann banked violently, instinctively executing evasion patterns drilled through years of combat experience. Nothing worked. Every burst exploded within lethal range. His wingman's aircraft disintegrated in a fireball that violated everything Hoffmann understood about artillery effectiveness. Anti-aircraft fire wasn't supposed to achieve direct proximity. It created zones of fragmentation that aircraft might enter. But these detonations were hunting individual aircraft, exploding with precision that suggested guidance, yet no visible tracking mechanism existed. Hoffmann's training insisted this was impossible. Artillery shells couldn't track aircraft, yet the evidence screamed otherwise as his squadron disappeared into explosions that followed them through three-dimensional space. He retreated at maximum speed, climbing desperately into cloud cover, hearing 2 more aircraft from his squadron die behind him. Of 8 aircraft that began the mission, 3 survived. The kill rate, 62% in a single engagement, was statistically impossible according to every doctrine manual and combat analysis Hoffman had studied. Something fundamental had changed. American artillery had acquired capability that German intelligence had never predicted, planners had never anticipated, and pilots had no doctrine to counter. Back at base, Hoffman filed a mission report describing explosions that tracked aircraft, barrages with impossible accuracy, and losses that exceeded anything rational. His commanding officer read the report with visible skepticism. Combat stress caused perceptual distortions. Everyone knew that. Pilots under fire overestimated enemy effectiveness, but within days, similar reports arrived from other units. Aircraft losses over American positions were increasing dramatically. Pilots described anti-aircraft fire that behaved impossibly, detonating with precision that violated established understanding of artillery limitations. German intelligence analysts confronted the data with institutional disbelief. Luftwaffe doctrine had been refined through 5 years of combat across Europe, North Africa, and Russia. That doctrine insisted that artillery accuracy was constrained by mechanical limitations. Timed fuses required preset detonation, which meant shells exploded at specific altitudes regardless of aircraft presence. Pilots exploited that predictability by varying altitude rapidly, staying between barrage zones. But American fire was eliminating those safe zones, creating continuous threat at all altitudes simultaneously. The first captured proximity shell arrived at Luftwaffe Technical Intelligence in February 1945, recovered from a dud round that penetrated muddy ground without detonating. German engineers carefully disassembled it under laboratory conditions, photographing every component, analyzing circuit design, studying construction methods. What they discovered shocked technical experts who had assumed German electronics were superior. The shell contained a miniaturized radio transmitter receiver of extraordinary sophistication, designed to survive artillery firing and function while spinning at extreme rates. The circuit was elegant, efficient, and represented manufacturing capability that Germany could not replicate under wartime conditions. The strategic implications were devastating. German military philosophy emphasized technical superiority and doctrinal discipline. The assumption had always been that German engineering excellence would produce weapons that Allied industrial capacity couldn't match. But the proximity fuse reversed that equation. American pragmatism, combining adequate electronics with overwhelming production capacity, had created a weapon that German perfectionism couldn't counter. Germany could potentially design similar devices, but lacked the industrial capacity, raw materials, and time to mass produce them. The Allies were firing proximity shells at rates exceeding 100,000 monthly. Germany couldn't manufacture even 1,000. Senior Luftwaffe commanders faced a doctrinal crisis. Existing tactics assumed exploitable gaps in anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuse eliminated those gaps, creating continuous threat volumes that couldn't be evaded through altitude variation. Pilots requested new tactics, but none existed. The only viable response was avoiding American positions entirely, which meant ceding air superiority in critical theaters. Field Marshal Hermann Göring, reviewing intelligence reports, reportedly dismissed initial assessments as defeatist exaggeration. But combat losses were indisputable. German aircraft attrition over Allied positions increased from acceptable levels to unsustainable rates. Units that had operated effectively throughout the war suddenly couldn't survive missions. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by fuel shortages and pilot losses, couldn't afford additional attrition from artillery that had suddenly become far deadlier. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots, trained to respect artillery as a hazard but not an overwhelming threat, suddenly confronted barrages that seemed intelligently malicious. The explosions tracked aircraft personally, anticipated maneuvers, exploited moments of vulnerability. Combat stress increased dramatically. Pilots who survived encounters described feeling hunted by shells that possessed awareness. The mythology around American artillery capability grew to include exaggerations and misunderstandings, but the core truth remained. American shells were detonating with precision that German technology couldn't match and doctrine couldn't counter. The proximity fuse, kept secret through 2 years of production and deployment, was revealing itself decisively as winter 1945 transitioned toward spring. May 1945, 1400 hours, Berlin. The war in Europe ended with German surrender, and as Allied intelligence teams swept through captured facilities, they discovered warehouses filled with Luftwaffe technical reports analyzing American proximity fuses. The documents revealed something remarkable. German engineers had understood the technology quickly once they captured intact shells, but that understanding brought only frustration. They couldn't replicate it. The manufacturing precision, component miniaturization, and mass production capability were beyond Germany's industrial capacity under wartime conditions. The proximity fuse represented a uniquely American achievement, combining advanced physics with industrial-scale production to create a weapon that was both sophisticated and abundant. Statistical analysis completed after the war revealed the fuse's true impact with stunning clarity. Comparing identical combat scenarios before and after proximity, fuse deployment showed dramatic differences. In Pacific naval battles, anti-aircraft kill rates increased from approximately 3% to 19%, more than 6 times improvement. Each shell became dramatically more lethal because it detonated at optimal distance automatically, eliminating human calculation error. Against V-1 rockets targeting England, proximity-fused artillery achieved 80% intercept rates compared to 24% for conventional fuses. Thousands of civilian lives were saved because shells no longer needed perfect timing. They sensed their targets and detonated precisely. The strategic value transcended immediate combat effectiveness. The proximity fuse represented validation of American innovation philosophy, rapid development through practical engineering, massive industrial scaling, and deployment speed prioritizing operational effectiveness over theoretical perfection. While German engineering pursued optimal designs requiring years of refinement, American engineers built adequate solutions in months and compensated for imperfection through quantity. The proximity fuse wasn't the most sophisticated possible design. It was the most manufacturable design that worked reliably enough to deploy by the millions. Dr. Merle Tuve returned to civilian research immediately after the war, refusing public recognition and declining interviews for decades. The proximity fuse development remained classified until 1950, when declassified reports revealed the scale of the program to the public. Tuve expressed ambivalence about his creation, pride in technical achievement, mixed with discomfort about contributing to weapons technology. He spent his post-war career developing radio astronomy and particle physics research, consciously steering away from military applications. Yet he acknowledged privately that the proximity fuse represented one of the war's crucial innovations, saving Allied lives while accelerating the defeat of Axis air power. The factory workers who mass-produced the shells returned to civilian life carrying secrets they couldn't share. Margaret Hayes, the assembly line worker from Michigan, left Pontiac in 1946 to raise a family, never discussing her wartime work except in vague terms. When the proximity fuse was declassified, her children finally understood why she had worked such brutal hours during the war years. She kept a single photograph from the factory floor, showing dozens of women assembling circuits under bright lights, their faces reflecting concentration and determination. That photograph represented a transformation. American women, proving they could perform sophisticated technical work at industrial scales, forever changing assumptions about labor and capability. The technological legacy extended far beyond military applications. Miniaturized electronics developed for the proximity fuse accelerated civilian technology development. Techniques for mass-producing vacuum tubes, designing circuits to survive mechanical stress, and testing electronic reliability under extreme conditions became foundational knowledge for consumer electronics industries. The engineers and technicians trained during wartime production formed the core workforce that built America's post-war electronics industry. Proximity fuse manufacturing experience directly influenced television production, radio development, and eventually the transistor revolution that followed. The strategic lessons shaped military doctrine permanently. The proximity fuse demonstrated that advanced technology could provide decisive advantage if deployed rapidly and abundantly. Future weapons development emphasized operational deployment over laboratory perfection, recognizing that a working system in combat outweighed a superior system still in development. The collaboration between academic research, government funding, and industrial production established patterns that continued through Cold War weapons development and space exploration programs. Personal stories of impact emerged slowly as veterans returned and secrecy restrictions lifted. Naval gunners who had fired proximity shells credited them with survival, shooting down attacking aircraft that conventional ammunition would have missed. Bomber crews flying missions over Germany believed proximity-fused anti-aircraft defense around Allied positions reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness significantly, allowing safer operations. The personal testimonials added human dimension to statistical data. These weren't just weapons that improved kill rates. They were innovations that brought people home alive. By 1960, historians recognized the proximity fuse as one of World War II's most influential technologies, alongside radar, atomic weapons, and advanced aircraft. Unlike atomic weapons, which remained controversial and unused after 1945, the proximity fuse represented technological innovation that was unambiguously defensive, protecting forces and civilians from aerial attack. Its development demonstrated American capacity to innovate under extreme pressure, leveraging scientific expertise, industrial capability, and practical problem-solving to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The final assessment came from comparative analysis years after the war. Military historians calculated that without the proximity fuse, Allied casualties from aerial attack would have been significantly higher, particularly during the D-Day invasion, Battle of the Bulge, and Pacific Island campaigns, where air superiority was contested fiercely. The technology saved an estimated tens of thousands of Allied lives by making air defense dramatically more effective. That human cost, avoided because shells could detonate at precisely the right moment, represented the ultimate measure of success. The proximity fuse proved that innovation born from desperation, refined through determination, and deployed through industrial might could change the course of history, one precisely timed explosion at a time.